Dickinson, born on December 10, 1830, in Amherst, Massachusetts. Dickinson came from a prestigious family and had strong ties to her community, although she lived much of her life confined to her home. After studying for 7 years at Amherst Academy, she briefly attended Mount Holyoke Women's Seminary before returning to her family home in Amherst. Her neighbors considered her eccentric. She had a predilection for always wearing white clothes. She was known for refusing to greet guests, and in the last years of her life for not even wanting to leave her room. Dickinson never married, and most of her friendships she had depended entirely on her correspondence. In the privacy of her home, Dickinson was a prolific poet. However, during her lifetime, not even a dozen of her almost 1,800 poems were published. Her work published during her lifetime was significantly altered by editors, adapting them to the poetic rules and conventions of the time. However, Dickinson's poems are unique compared to their contemporaries. They contain short lines, usually lack titles, contain half rhymes, and unconventional punctuation. Many of her poems focus on themes related to death and immortality, two themes also recurring in letters she sent to her friends.
Dickinson poems generally fall into three distinct periods, the works in each period having certain general characters in common. Pre-1861, in the period before 1858, the poems are most often conventional and sentimental in nature. Thomas H. Johnson, who later published the poems of Emily Dickinson, was able to date only 5 Dickinson poems as written before 1858. Two of these are mock valentines done in an ornate and humorous styles. Two others are conventional lyrics, one of which is about missing her brother Austin, and the fifth poem, which begins, I have been in springs, covens her grief over the feared loss of friendship, and was sent to her friend Sue Gilbert. Lastly, the post-1866, only a third of Dickinson's poems were written in the last 20 years of her life, when her poetic production slowed considerably. During this period, she no longer collected her poems in fascicles. 4 months before her 20th birthday, Emily Dickinson met the person who became her first love and remained her greatest, an orphaned mathematician in training by the name of Susan Gilbert. 9 years later, her junior. Through the poet's life, Susan will be her muse, her mentor, and her primary reader and editor. Her fairest long-life attachment, her only woman in the world. A tempest of intimacy swirled over the 18 months following Susan's arrival into the Dickinson's lives. The two young women took long walks in the woods together, exchanged books, read poetry to each other, and commenced an intense, intimate correspondence that would involve a premature but would last a lifetime. We are the only poets, Emily told Susan, and everyone else is prose. When Susan accepted a 10-month appointment as a math teacher in Baltimore in the autumn of 1851, Emily was devastated at the separation, but tried to keep a buoyant heart. I fancy you very often descend into the schoolroom with a plum binomial theorem strolling in your hand, which you must dissect and exhibit your uncomprehending ones. She tasted in a letter. Susan was science personified, capitalized. She will haunt Dickinson's poems for decades to come as science.
After the deaths of Newton and Wordsworth, Emily Dickinson's life became completely empty, and her only path to avoid that was through poetry. Though she allowed only a few, aside from mentioned family members, to read her works while she was alive. Professionals in literature, such as readers, critics, teachers, or editors, and they could be counted on one hand. Emily Dickinson's self-imposed seclusion and isolation were not sudden or abnormal at the beginning. In her 20s and 30s, around 1861, Emily attended church, went shopping, and behaved perfectly in all aspects. She took long walks with her dog, Carlo, and even attended exhibitions. By 1817, despite Higginson's pleas for her to go out, her decision to seclude herself was final. I don't cross my father's land, I no longer go to any other house, nor do I move from the town. This acceleration of private life had by then turned into a kind of phobia or morbid aversion to people, something like agoraphobia. During the last 3 years of her life, she didn't even leave her room. When her youngest nephew, the last child of Augustine Dickinson and Susan Gilbert, died, Emily's spirit, who adored the child, was definitely broken. She spent the entire summer of 1884 in a chair, crippled by Bright's disease. In early 1886, she wrote her last letter to her cousin. They call me.